Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Taqwa Abu Kamal. I will present our. I am gonna present our moderator. Mr. Uveys Han is a senior fellow at CIGA. He works on Islamic political theory and post-colonial theory. So the mic is yours, Mr. Han.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our session for today. The session will last until 3:30. I hope you had a good lunch. And I would like to invite the panelist of the session up, who is here to join us. We have a few people who will be online. So he won't be here. He won't be here. Eunice, who do we have? You just go. We'll be covering the topic of colonialism and Zionism. And I think that it's a very important topic because one of the reasons that Islamophobia became such an issue today is because it has a long history of anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic discourse that was part of the colonial project. So there are historical roots, both extending out of direct colonialism in Muslim societies, and then very specifically Zionism, which is a carry-on of an explicit colonial project, just as Kashmir is today. So I will first introduce our first panelist, Dr. Usman Shahid. Inshallah. So Usman Shahid Hoja, as they say in Turkey. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science and IR at the University of Central Punjab. He has earned his master's in human rights from the University of London, and he also has a master's in international relations from University of Punjab. His research is on Sufism, Islamophobia, human rights. He's a leading commentator on a number of TV channels and media sectors. He has also been a part of a lot of NGOs and activist platforms working with refugees and youth. Welcome, senior lecturer Usman Shahid. The floor is yours. Yes, you can use that.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible? Am I audible enough? Okay, fair. Thank you. First of all, I'd really like to thank CIGA and ZAM University for giving me this amazing opportunity to be participating, interacting, and now presenting my paper before such cultivated minds. And I'd really like to thank Bilal Ghazanfar, my friend, who am I afraid he's not here, but this paper, it would have been impossible to bring it to life without his efforts. So the study aims to develop, sorry, just a second. So my topic is long-term impact of colonialism on Sufism, a case study of subcontinent. And this study aims to develop causal relationship between colonial policies against Sufism in 19th century and contemporary Islamophobic trends in Pakistan. British Orientalists misinterpreted the Sufi philosophy, while colonialists politicized their spirituality and traditions to tighten their grip on subcontinent. This colonial construction of Sufism by British Orientalists, along with the colonialist policy, not only weakened the Sufism, but also compelled the collective Islamic historical memory to take certain trajectory in subcontinent that suits colonialists at that time, and ironically westernized secular elite and fanatics with majority Muslim population country like in Pakistan in contemporary era. So Sufism or Tasawwuf or mystical Islam is one of the most misunderstood, misperceived, misrepresented and misquoted dimension of Islam. Denoting Sufism while referring to various definitions, the principal significance lies in defining it. In the words of N. Mary Schimmel, an influential German Orientalist, and I quote, mysticism can be defined as love of the absolute. For the power that separates true mysticism from mere asceticism is love, and for the Sufis, love is the only legitimate way to educate the base faculties. Sufism is an expression of the inward or internal batin and esoteric aspect of Islam and designates the whole of the contemplated ways founded on the sacred forms of Islam. So Sufism in all forms is conceptualized and conceived as the tremendously convincing and compelling force of spiritual legitimacy. In case of subcontinent, because of the pluralistic vision of Sufi philosophy, Sufi shrines were spaces open to everyone, irrespective of visitors' beliefs, religion, race, gender, and caste. Sufi rich pluralistic traditions and culture in subcontinent have been a significant reason to make different religious communities live in a harmonious environment for centuries. In different eras, Sufism or Tasawwuf has been subjected to range of interpretation by Islamic and non-Islamic scholarship. Anti-Sufi narratives have been propagated in various eras of Islamic history and within certain sections of mainstream Islam and non-Muslim actors. The defined Islamic laws were evident in the teachings of some of the early Sufis who hold central importance in Sufism, including Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, the traditional founder of Qadiriya Sufi order, and Sayyid Ali Hajweri. Latter defines the relationship of Sharia and Tariqa, and I quote in his famous book Kashful Majub, and I quote, the mutual relationship is like that of the body and spirit. When the spirit leaves the living body is a corpse, and the spirit disappears like the wind, quote end. This approach and attitude towards Sufism was typical of the most Muslim intellectuals up through the 18th century. British Orientalists considered Sufi doctrine and philosophy in contradiction with Islam. The very first scholars to write on Sufism were Sir William Jones and Sir John Malcolm. Both were part of the East India Company. They were least interested in exploring Sufis, its deep-rooted Islamic heritage. Ironically, instead of reading Ibn Arabi and Ghazali and other credible work undertaken by Muslim theologians and philosophers on Sufism, most of those Orientalists relied on secondary and controversial sources. The colonialist force and subcontinent perceived coordinated Sufi brotherhood and networks as a threat to colonial agendas in subcontinent following the 1857 mutiny. Colonialist masters politicized the spirituality and tradition of Sufi networks to tighten their grip on subcontinent. This colonial construction of Sufism by British Orientalists along with the colonialist policy not only weakened the Sufism, but also compelled the collective Islamic historical memory to take certain trajectory in subcontinent that suits colonialists at that time and now westernized secular elite of Pakistan. Before independence, subcontinent was dotted with the Sufi networks and spiritual lineages, while Sufi shrines varied in type, status, and influence. In the context of subcontinent, Sufism can be realized as centuries of interactions, connections, ever-changing power dynamics, and relationships among Sufis, political elites, and indigenous societies. The sheer importance and reputation linked to shrines designate that Hankas and Dargahs have always been seen as the places of authority and sovereignty in terms of political, religious, and cultural perspectives. Sufi shrines always remain potent bases of cultural legitimacy. The different Sufi schools of thoughts and saints have been patronized and persecuted in different times by Muslims and non-Muslim regimes to consolidate the power and control the territory. Peruvian sociologist Anabel Cuyano's notion of coloniality of power recognizes a hierarchical structure of the world between the dominating Western white people and the dominated non-Western populations in every social domain like epistemology, ontology, politics, economy, culture, and language. Islamophobia is an epistemic, in the words of Salman Sayyid, the famous British scholar. Islamophobia is an epistemic racism that has become a tradition and belief in which the West is seen to be the solely legitimate belief or thought able to generate knowledge and the only one reach to universality, rationality, and truth. This form of racism is linked to the global political perspective, which is so organized and designed by the post-colonial order. For a Muslim identity to exist in today's world has become impossible due to Islamophobia, and the challenge of being Muslim in today's world is that there is no identity to exist. And the secular political elite in former colonies like Pakistan continue to disdain and despise the traditional value system and local cultures and customs which are not in line with the modernity under the definition of European imperialism. This mindset promotes Islamophobic trends and creates acceptance for the discourse which automatically dismiss and reject the Islamic civilization's ideals, ethics, and value system and regard them as non-democratic, irrational, non-universal, and particularistic. Islam was seen as a practical challenge and viable target due to the racial thinking of colonialists. Sufi networks posed a formidable challenge to the imperial authorities and their domination. The primary reason was the attraction of Sufis to all communities and strata of society in subcontinent. Sufis and these shared spaces were not ready to be tailored in the imperial classifications of religions, ethno-linguistics, and cultural and religious difference. In subcontinent, religion was not treated and seen as an irritant or divisive factor. Rather, different religious communities have been part of religious traditions beyond the boundaries of their faith. That religious harmony was damaged by politicization of religion and institutionalization of Muslim indigenous communities during British colonialism in subcontinent after 18th century. British colonialists in subcontinent largely viewed Sufi saints, shrines, and their networks as the symbols and codes of Muslim architecture and rule and sources of superstitious knowledge, practices, and tradition that had to be managed and manipulated for exertion of political control. The British patronization of Sufism by allocating and providing the descendants and families of Sufis with the lands and other perks started taking its toll. Colonial powers in subcontinent were the beneficiary of the support base, and following the debacle of Mughal dynasty, they started to corrupt the Sufi orders by including them in the power structure and contaminated the original spirit of this mystic version of Islam. Imperial forces tried to use and exploit Sufi saints and popularity of their networks and reputation to not only consolidate power, but exploited the links of Sufis with indigenous people, especially with rural and agricultural communities, to tighten their administrative grip. In Pakistani context, religion has always been a matter of concern, not only for people, but for the state and the political elite. British colonization of subcontinent employed religion as a leading identity marker and a rallying point, initially to struggle for an independent homeland, and later for Islamization in the newly born state as nation building. The whole discourse and the partition's bloody aftermath empowered the radical mind in the absence of structures and weak state enforcement institution. Later, state changed the course and moved from religionization of politics to politicization of religion, which has contracted the social space for a discourse about the role of religion and Islam, and this has made secularists and conservatives prone to radicalism. In Pakistan, we can find the commonalities between Western Islamophobia and homegrown Islamophobia. A dominant secular westernized political elite group with a captive mind has systematically excluded the large faction of Muslim society who are very sensitive towards their religions, religious identity from the rights and resources. These power elites are part of different societal organizations, and their qualification, academic credentials, social status, and economic class absorbed into the power strata. On societal level, we see synchronization of these elite secular groups who are structurally differentiated and vigorously active in society. Islamophobia in Pakistani context can be traced out as a cognitive expression of pessimism, biases, and emotive prejudice towards Islam as a discredited belief system, and practicing Muslim are stereotyped and labeled. This kind of specific group focus enmity is a particular aspect of shiny and respectable and enlightened Islamophobia. Decoloniality tries to understand why coloniality still exists, not just in the remains of imperialism, but in the structure of world itself. It fights back against the colonial instrumentalization of reason. The goal of decoloniality is to degrade the colonial power structure in order to achieve emancipation. It comprises a method of criticism that fights colonialities and its related systems suppose universalism. Pakistan, a former British colony with the second largest Muslim majority population in the world, where political elite have not only earned their higher education from academic institutions of the Western world, but also have properties in global North. Many among those have the same westernized thought patterns. The cycle of the intellectual dependency is obvious for those political elites who earned their academic credentials and were educated from global North and not in their native lands. Colonial, political, and cultural elite in Muslim majority countries operate and work within the sphere of secular nation-state, epistemological framework, and racial formation. The clash of worldviews during the process of modernization and particular westernization also undermined the contribution and role of Islamic normative standpoints in favor of the nation-state perspective, which resulted in the conflicts and disturbance in former colonies. Disconnecting Sufism with Islamic faith is not a past phenomena. It still exists in present time. In case of Pakistan, the Western-oriented mindset and thought pattern subscribed the narrative legacy of colonialism towards Sufism in Pakistan. The secular elite, however, recognize the humanistic character of Sufism. They participate in the Sufi festivals, Sufi rituals, and appreciate the Dhamal culture associated with Sufism and listen Qawwali music in public and private gatherings. They considered these conditions in the cultural context, but like their Western counterparts, don't acknowledge the Islamic dimension of Sufism. If you zoom in on subcontinent society, within herself, there have been potent local tradition and heritage of pluralism, diversity, and cosmopolitanism echoed in its folk tales, folk wisdom, art, culture, and literature. These rich legacies are connected with mysticism and Sufism of the subcontinent. Over the centuries, in the multi-religious subcontinent, Sufi saints and Sufi poets, Data Ali Hajweri, Moinuddin Chishti, Baba Farid, Sultan Bahu, Baba Bulle Shah, Mian Muhammad Baksh, Lal Shehbaz Qalandar, Shah Abdul Latif Bhai, and Waris Shah fostered and promoted tolerance, benevolence, tranquility, togetherness, harmony, inclusivity, and universalist Islamic religious heritage and tradition in the subcontinent. In Pakistan, true Sufism is less in practice, but more in Sufi teachings and poetry. There is no doubt that Sufism is a beacon of hope and a source of fulfillment, solace, and well-being for large sections of Pakistani society. A country having youth bulge of 63% of total population is struggling its image abroad as a state, while the youth has been striving in searching of their true religious identity. The Western secular elite could only offer them Western culture to adjust with if they are to survive to their futures. This West toxification of Pakistani society and a xenocentric approach can make religion irrelevant in people's lives. It is a new form of colonialism which can again con this former colony and rob her from its religious identity. Contemporary Sufism need not only reforms, but renaissance too. There is no doubt that non-Muslim pilgrimages to shrine and tombs in subcontinent contributed and influenced some rituals which are not part of traditional Islam. There are many scholars in the West who uncritically embrace the fundamentalists as the true representatives of Islam and tacitly acknowledge the denunciation of Sufism by the fundamentalists as fringe phenomena to Islamic faith. While the secular Western elite come up with such approach towards which the colonial masters are happy with, Pakistan military dictators Musharraf's policy of enlightened moderation was an example of it during the period of war on terror. Sufism can play a critical role in countering the extreme and violent religious patterns in Pakistani society, which has got nothing to do with Islam, and work as a soft power. Worked as soft power. It has a definite answer to the confused Pakistani youth about the Muslim identity. Sufism can defend the true Islamic values and beliefs while responding to the local Islamophobic currents infused by the secular elite networks, and seize the flawed and faulty narratives and hysteria against Islam as a peaceful faith. For many Pakistanis, Sufi shrines are a home away from home, which needs to be protected from the burglars. And these are some steps taken by our former Prime Minister Imran Khan. He established a university after the name of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jalani Al Qadir University, and our first lady at that time, his wife, she established an institution, Shazli Center, after the name of great Islamic Moroccan scholar, Hassan Shazli. Thank you.
I will try to move along and then have the question and answer afterwards, so we can have a conversation with all the participants. So next we have Mubashir Saleem. Muhammad Saleem is a research scholar of Islamic sciences and history affiliated with Khwaja Farid Rahim Yar Khan, Pakistan. Currently, he is a lecturer in history at Government Graduate College, Alipur, Pakistan. He has secured distinctions in as a master in history from University of Punjab and a post-graduation in interfaith studies. His research interests include interfaith relations, history of religions, world civilizations, and Sufism. As a young researcher, he has research papers published in international journals, and he has presented his work at a number of conferences. We are honored to have him with us today. Muhammad Saleem, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all of you to giving me this opportunity to present my paper on Islamophobia as colonial legacy and a correlation in historical discourse of South Asia. So I will explain these points in my own words. I have
Before you begin, I may interrupt your talk to remind you that you have 5 minutes left. So please excuse that when that happens. There you go. No, when he has 5 minutes left.
okay. I have 5 minutes left.
No,
Okay.
I said that I will remind you when you have 5 minutes left. You have a total of 15 minutes to speak.
Okay. I will start that first of all, how we can conceptualize Islamophobia. It is very important to understand. Then we will move to the topic that Islamophobia is a colonial legacy, because we are following same steps. We are observing those practices which were practiced at that time during colonial time period, especially with the reference of South Asia. So first of all, Islamophobia is not about to abuse Muslims. It is not about to discriminate. It is a total negative behavior or hostile behavior which is adopted towards Muslims. So we will see that concept that it has been developed over the centuries. And there are few dimensions of Islamophobia, because sometimes Islamophobia means Muslims are considered inferior to the Christian world. and Muslims are called, they are alien to God. And sometimes Islam is perceived as ideology of taking advantage on political level or military level. And sometimes Islam is called a threatening, aggressive, a violent, and terrorist religion. So these type of concepts, they are part of Islamophobia, which we can observe nowadays in whole world and especially in Muslim majority countries. Uh, I will talk about with reference of South Asia. So this behavior, how this behavior developed, uh, especially in the West. So it is developed by their innovative minority, means their think tanks, their state agencies, and they develop these ideas, these stereotypes, these concepts, and it is followed by their imitative majority, means the people, they just followed uh, those concepts which are given by their innovative minority, means their think tanks, state agencies, etc. So as far as my topic is concerned, which is specific related to colonialism, and it is in South Asia, how colonialism developed Islamophobia, and still we can see Islamophobia in South Asia. So how it is linked with colonial time period in South Asia. There are a lot of work which have been done. They are very tremendous works which explored the link between Islamophobia and colonialism. For example, Salman Sayyid, Abul Karim, Wakil, and Asad Mir, they have written tremendous and very excellent articles and material on, especially on the link of Islamophobia and colonialism. So I will move to my point of view. I have argument that in South Asia, Islamophobia has relation with colonialism, and it is a correlation. It is not a causation. Means colonialism was practiced, and it can be observed in history on many areas. But it is not true that we can relate that whenever colonialism will be found, there will be Islamophobia. So in European countries and some African countries where colonial powers, they ruled on non-Muslim states and areas, there was no Islamophobia. But whenever we will talk about Islamophobia in South Asia, it will be linked with colonialism. So there is a correlation between colonialism and Islamophobia in South Asia. So there are some other factors. Mostly Western scholars, they relate Islamophobia with 9/11 attacks, and they said that it is the beginning of Islamophobia, means the hate against Muslims started with our own actions. So it is their own argument that our actions were the main cause of hate against us. So they start Islamophobia and this concept of Islamophobia, the emergence of Islamophobia, with our mistakes, with the Muslims' actions in 9/11. It is one perspective, but we should see that this phenomena emerged over the centuries throughout our relationship between Muslims and European Christians and even Hindus in South Asia. Apart from the most dominant factor, 9/11 attacks, there are some other factors. For example, Orientalism. Orientalism was one of the key factors behind emerging Islamophobia against Muslims. So On Orientalism, a great work of Edward Said we have. So he has written extensively on the effects of Orientalism, especially on Islam. Moreover, there are another factors behind Islamophobia. For example, Crusade wars. It was also a factor in Islamophobia. But European scholars, especially, they neglect the impact on these wars on Muslims. However, we will move to relate Islamophobia and colonialism in South Asia. So in South Asia, what had been done by British against Muslims, same practices, same ideas, they are adopted by other communities in contemporary world against Muslims. British had left South Asia, but they had left their legacy, their practices, their mindset to the other majority communities in South Asia, especially to Hindus. So one by one, I will explain those legacies which were those practices which were adopted by British, and now they are uh, continued by others. For example, the first thing when British came here, uh, their narrative was very important, and their narrative was based on self versus other narrative. Means they their self was superior, and the others and all the Indians, including Muslims and some others, they were inferiors. So that was the mindset. So they did not uh, invaded India uh, militarily, but they came with mindset. They came with self-image, a superior self-image. So when you create self versus other narrative, you neglect positives, you neglect uh, positive attitudes. So same attitude has been adopted by some other communities here now, especially Hindus. So they had picked the negativities in South Asian Muslim history, and they are saying that they are superior. The India is for Indians. The subcontinent, this whole world, the whole Indian subcontinent is for the Indians, not for the Muslims, because they.
I just want to remind you, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Secondly, British imposed their policies as the sign of superiority, and same practice were adopted by Hindus, especially in subcontinent. For example, when British came here, they dismissed Persian language. They announced English as the official language. So we will see that after War of Independence 1857, Hindus started a campaign for Hindi as the official language in 1867. That is known as the Urdu Hindi controversy. Why they hated Urdu? Because of its link with Islam. So it is not the behavior about Islamic religion, it is the negative behavior against all those things which are associated with Muslims in South Asia. So still they did not respect Urdu, and it is the legacy which they adopt from, because they consider their language superior than other languages, especially Urdu, which is associated with Islam. Uh, because Urdu language is its script is similar to Arabic. Moreover, nowadays Muslims, especially in Pakistan, in Kashmir, they are called terrorists, rebels. So how they adopt this behavior, it is also a colonial legacy. For example, in 1857, when War of Independence was fought in India, so uh, it was called Muslim mutiny, means it is patronized by Muslims, and Muslims were called disloyal, Muslims were called rebels, and after War of Independence, British did not trust Muslims. So same attitude nowadays, same argument is given by some others in South Asia, and Muslims are called rebels. Not revolutionary, they are rebels. Even Kashmiri Muslims, they are called now rebels. So they adopted the same policy, same practice. Moreover, during colonial time period, Muslim heroes, uh, legends, they were dehumanized. Colonial literature was used to defame Islam. For example, the book of William Muir on the life of Holy Prophet, same case is with Mahmud of Ghazni and Aurangzeb. These characters, they were criticized in colonial literature. So same thing here now after in post-colonial time period, Hindus and some others people, they are continuing same policy and they are defaming our heroes in literature. And the fifth thing which they had adopted from colonial time period, uh, during British time period, British encouraged Hindus and their hegemony in India. For example, during British time period, Congress rule was during uh, 1937 to 39, in which Hindus adopted a policy of song Bande Mataram, in which it is related to that theme that India is for Indians, not for the others.
Mohammed, you have
So,
one more minute.
okay, so it has a long-lasting effect. Now we can see that Indians, they are calling the Muslims in India that you are inferior, you are strangers, you are aliens. This home is not for yourself. And in Burma, we can see that in 2015 and 17, a Muslim genocide uh, happened. And what was called to Rohingya Muslims, that this land is not for yourselves, you are strangers, you are aliens. And because in British time period, when Bande Mataram was adopted by Hindus, it was the wording that the land of Hindustan is only for Hindus, not for the Muslims. And same policy was adopted by for Rohingya Muslims by Burma. Thank you. Um Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Kainat Batool. She is from Punjab. She completed her bachelor's degree at the University of Punjab, and she also did her master's at Kinyard College for Women University at Lahore in Lahore, Pakistan. Her research is on religion, gender and education, geopolitics. Her research has been presented at a number of national and international conferences. Her and her colleague, Rana Aurangzeb, will be presenting on examining the role of colonialism on the recent developments of Islamophobia and anti-Pakistan narrative. Kainat, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. First, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to present my paper. And I would also want to extend my thoughts and prayers to everyone who, in any capacity, affected by recent earthquakes in Turkey. Now, without further ado, I would like to present my paper. The topic of my presentation is examining the colonialism on the recent developments of Islamophobia and anti-Pakistan narrative. The introduction. Right. The term Islamophobia, which was derived from Greek word, means fear of Islam, but it has been widely used in media outlets as well as in political and intellectual discussions. However, the usage of this term is not limited here. It has been taken up the form of racism by connoting Islamophobia with the fear of Muslims. The incorporation of this concept in the works of international organizations such as United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation prove its global acceptance, despite the fact that a fraction of people disagree with this perception. Islamophobia manifests itself in a variety of ways from the United States to Europe and Asia. However, for Pakistan, which is an Islamic republic, it presents a moral as well as ideological threat, since Pakistan got independence in the name of Islam. The violent acts of Islamophobia in the neighboring India are often under discussion. However, in Pakistan, however, the major concern was raised over the Islamophobic incident in Europe, especially in France. In the late 2020 and in early 2021, media reported wide eruption of protests in Pakistan, and some of the violent protests were staged by the then banned far-right party in Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan. They called for the ban of French goods and trades and demand the expulsion of French ambassador. Unfortunately, such incidents were used against Muslims by Islamophobes by branding Muslim to be inherently violent. And the leadership of Pakistan was not blind to these facts. The then Indian Prime Minister of Pakistan, Sheikh Rashid Ahmed, stated that the demands of Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan could have portrayed Pakistan as a radical nation. Hence, the perception that Muslims are violent and Islam an extremist religion is now commonly held opinion in the national media outlets. Now, coming to the history of Islamophobia as a type of racism in Europe, the history of Islamophobia can be traced back to the 15th century Europe, where a Christian-centered theological hierarchy was established that made Islam appear as a less essential religion. In 1492, Spain Christians under monarchical rule recaptured the Muslim lands and expelled them from Iberian Peninsula along with Jews. They also developed a worldwide racial ethnic hierarchy where people of European heritage were placed at the higher tier than those of other backgrounds. At the same time, in 1492, another important event occurred, and that was the so-called discovery of Americas. Now, in this world system, which was not only Christian centric but also marked by modern, westernized, colonial, patriarchal system, the religious beliefs were one of the first measures of otherness. The discourse of racism has been changed over the past 60 years from biological racism to cultural racism. The cultural racism emphasizes on the culture inferiority of a group, which includes its habits, conducts, beliefs, etc. The cultural racism takes up a new form dominated by religious tenets, where religious beliefs are singled out by describing as barbarians, primitive, uncivilized, authoritarians, underdeveloped, savage, and tyrant beings. The link between Islamophobia and racism can only be comprehended by taking in consideration the long-term history of cultural hegemony, which is still prevalent today. Muslims were branded as the colonial subjects of Western Empire. The unfortunate incident of 9/11 created an Islamic hysteria, and as a result of this, the South Asian Muslims and African Muslims living in the West felt a tinge of racism due to the media portrayal of Muslims as violent. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, took it into his consideration, and he talked about the Islamophobic attitudes of Europe. He also wrote a letter to the CEO of Facebook in which he called treating Islamophobia with same sternness as the denial of Holocaust. Now I will explain how uh, okay. Am I visible? Am I audible to you?
Yes, you're still audible. We're
Okay,
still
okay,
following along.
okay, all right, thank you. So Islamophobia in the guise of colonialism and Orientalism. The term Islamophobia is not new. However, it gained a formal recognition after the flagship report by Renner Trust in 1997. We stated that it has various manifestations. Uh, we stated that the word is not ideal, but is recognizably similar to xenophobia and Europhobia, and is a useful shorthand way of referring to dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. Such dread and dislike have existed in the Western countries and cultures for several centuries. In the last 20 years, however, the dislike has become more explicit, more extreme, and more dangerous. All right. So, Islamophobia today is a legacy of European colonial past when they subjugated most of Muslim states under the mere perception of superiority. Perceiving Islam from the lens of Europe was also prevalent and termed as Orientalism. And despite the worldwide condemnation of colonialism and Orientalism in intellectual discourses, it is still prevalent today. A poll was conducted by CNN in 2018, which shows that 31% of Europeans found that 72%, that Europeans had 31% Europeans had unfavorable view about Muslims, and another research was conducted by Pew Research, which found that 72% Hungarians had unfavorable views of Muslims. Now, I will talk about how Islamophobia had created the base of anti-Pakistan narrative. So the pandemic of COVID-19 proved to be a havoc for all the countries. And even in these dire conditions, the European community took the chance of scapegoating the spread of virus to local Muslim communities and provided a further justification of Islamophobia in Europe. Muslims were dichotomized as good Muslims who gave up their life as medical professionals, and the bad Muslims who simply didn't. So the Telegraph report portrayed Muslims as unruly mass and dehumanized them by referring to them as large groups instead of individuals. As suggested by Williamson and Poole, some of the reporting, which was overshadowed by Islamophobia, also had anti-Pakistan sentiments. The editor's code of ethics was breached by the Telegraph when an article was published on June 26, 2022, was headlined as Pakistan singled out as the origin of half of Britain's imported virus cases. Howbeit, it became evident that the remarks made during COVID-19 was engraved in the colonial roots, and the tendency of Europeans to retort to the negative image of Muslims when faced with an adversity which clearly needs scapegoating. Now, this paper would like to suggest some strategies for Pakistan to counter Islamophobia, and at this point, it has been clear that Islamophobia, eradicating Islamophobia is not only the responsibility of Muslim nations, it is also a responsibility of European nations, where the colonial mindset is deeply engraved. And Pakistan will take the responsibility of identifying and highlighting the incidents that involve anti-Muslim injustice in order to bring European leaders' attention towards it. Pakistan will
Kainat,
also
you have only 5 more minutes.
All right. Pakistan will also continue to put efforts in developing effective measures against further manifestation of Islamophobia. Pakistan has been an active participant of international as well as regional organizations, such as it presented a resolution in Organization of Islamic Cooperation for making 15 March as International Day to Combat Islamophobia, which was unanimously accepted by the participating nations and UN General Assembly and implemented on March 15, 2022. Foreign Office of Pakistan also identified 2 areas on which Pakistan is currently working, and needs to work more rigidly in the future, which includes education and counter disinformation. And by employing soft power and the use of cultural influence, Europe and Pakistan can be educated about the nature and true spirit of Islam in order to break down all the stereotypes against Islam. Second thesis, it is crucial for Pakistan to counter disinformation, which is more malicious than misinformation, and which can be done by using platforms such as which widely information which is both reliable and authentic. To conclude my research, Islamophobia has a deep-rooted history in Europe, which is in the modern world is manifesting itself in different forms. Colonialism and Oriental stress the stereotype of Islam being inherently violent, which is still prevalent. Despite the modern-day legal, social, and cultural development, Islam is seen with suspicion. Islamophobia presents double challenges to Pakistan since it was created in the name of Islam, and any attack on Islam is direct attack on its ideological basis. Pakistan is facing anti-Pakistan racism, along with sentiments that are born out of digital formation against Islam, Muslims, and Pakistan. Hence, it is the responsibility of those majority European states where Muslims living in minority to adopt the strategies to tackle the issue of Islamophobia. However, Pakistan is determined to actively participate in this cause. Thank you.
Very much for your brilliant paper. I would like to now go back to our third participant online, David Miller. Is he there? David Miller is he is an investigative researcher interested in concentrations of power in society and how they might be democratized and made accountable. His recent work has focused on terrorism and counterterrorism, the sociology of expertise, lobbying, public relations. Especially his focus has been the British government, think tanks, Islamophobia, and the Zionist movement. David Miller is the director of Public Interest Investigations, a nonprofit company, and also he is the director of a nonprofit organization for propaganda studies. David Miller, the floor is yours. And he's also a non-resident fellow at CIGA.
I am. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes,
great. How long do I have? 15 minutes, is it?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk today about Zionist Islamophobia. And I want to talk about the specific contribution that Zionism makes to Islamophobia in the contemporary period. Now, I thought the previous talks were all very interesting for various reasons, and in particular the historical stuff, looking back to colonialism and the legacies of colonialism. And I wanted to say really, by way of maybe development of that point, that in the contemporary period, yes, there are legacies of colonialism, but of course there still is colonialism in the world, most obviously, given the topic in Palestine. And as a result, we need to talk not just about the legacies of colonialism, but about the concrete driving forces behind the creation where it hadn't existed before and the expansion of Islamophobia in different parts of the world. So yes, I absolutely take the point about it didn't start in 9/11, but there were specific things which happened as a result of 9/11, and I want to talk a little bit about where some of those came from, because what happened after 9/11 had been, if not consciously, practically prepared for by the development of Islamophobic ideas, in particular, I would argue, since 1979. And I think that's a key moment, which I'll try and explain why. But let's start the talk by talking a little bit about why it is that I say that Zionism is Islamophobic. Now, we're all aware, I guess, of the famous judgment of the UN in Durban that Zionism is racism. And so I don't need to tell you much about that, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why it is that we say that Zionism is racism, first of all, before I go on to talking about the specific contribution that Zionism has made to Islamophobia. Now, I have I'm going to put something in the chat. There's some background here in the chat, a link to one of our web pages on the term Islamist and Islamism, which I'm going to come to after I've talked about Israeli and Zionist racism. Hopefully we can talk a bit much more about that when we get there, but there's a lot more detail there. People might want to check the details and the citations afterwards. Okay, so let me go on to talk about Zionist racism and Zionist Islamophobia. So, I mean, Zionism obviously has to be racist. It had to find a way to convince people, not necessarily the Palestinians, in fact, definitely not the Palestinians, but they had to find a way to convince people that what they were doing was not simply a form of racism. So the leaders of the Zionist movement, the founders of the State of Israel, had well-known anti-Arab racism. This is an ideology that helped them to justify the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948 and later, and their continued exile, as well as the oppression of those who remained within the borders of what's called Israel in 1948. There's, of course, a wealth of data, and I have a written version of this talk which I can send if people want to look at the links, the references, indicating the factual basis of this claim. It's not seriously in doubt. A recent study of the openly racist right in Israel, meaning the ones who are currently have the whip-hand in government, notes that the idea of transfer, which of course is a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, was promoted and pursued secretly or openly by the majority of Zionist leaders, from Theodor Herzl to David Ben-Gurion, the famed socialist Zionist. Such ideas, of course, are fed by the settler movement in its ongoing attempts to further justify further dispossession and violence, which we've seen all too much of in the last fortnight, as everyone has seen the pogroms, ethnic cleansing described by Zionists as pogroms in occupied Palestine. There are currents, of course, of pro-settler opinion, pro-Jewish settler opinion in the US, which are informed by this context in Israel. These forms of racism were fundamental to the creation of Israel and the way it operates today. That you can get a taste of it, you don't need to look very far to get a taste of it, can be gleaned from the widely available footage online of the annual Flag Day march in Jerusalem, which is their word for Al-Quds, when gangs of extremist settlers rampage around the Muslim quarter of the old city, chanting picturesquely as they do, "Death to the Arabs" and "May your village burn," and similar delightful slogans. But anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism are accompanied, I would argue, by a deep and abiding complex of anti-Muslim, specifically anti-Muslim prejudice. At root, these present Muslims as a threat, drawing on many older, what I believe people might call tropes, not just to the Zionist project, but to Western civilization as a whole. Amongst them, of course, are conspiracy theories, such as that there is a special Muslim propensity towards violence and terrorism, that Islam guides the alleged reactionary political behavior of Muslims, expressed in the use of the term Islamism, or the idea of Islamic terrorism. These, of course, originated with the Zionist movement and its associated ideologues, including notably the British Zionist historian, Bernard Lewis. And this is where I would turn to the link that I've given you there in the chat. Maybe I can put that on the screen. Let me see if I can share the screen for that. Sorry. It's this one I want. No, it's that one. Where is it? This one. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I have to change the preferences. Let's forget that. I mean, it's on the link there. Let me just describe this diagram. This is a Google Ngram which I produced some years ago, couple of years ago, which has Google Ngrams, as some of you will know, is a mechanism for searching books in publication going back to 1800 in various languages. And of course, the languages, the availability in different languages varies, but I did it in English. And I looked for terms such as Islamist, Islamism, jihadist, jihadi, and Islamic terrorism. And we find that until 1979, none of these terms occur in books in English. The term, with the exception of the term Islamism, which is extremely prominent, especially in peaking in the 1860s, a term widely used in books in English. Now, of course, what the term Islamism meant then largely was the study of Islam. So a kind of Islamologist, if you like, and was widely used, not as a term to diminish Muslims, but simply as a term for people who studied Islam, including imams, for example. And it declines through the 20th century to a low around about 1920, which doesn't really pick up again until the mid-1980s. But what does pick up from 1979 onwards is this new term, which had never really appeared in English, and I think still doesn't appear in French, but the French have a different terminology for it. And that is the term Islamist. So Islamist doesn't appear as a term in English published books until 1979 and after. And it starts off relatively small, and I'm going to explain why, and then gets to a peak around about 2000. And the data doesn't go much beyond there at present. Of course, it would be interesting to look back. And if you look at the peak is above the peak of the use of the word Islamism in the 1860s in books. Now, so why did people start using the term Islamist in 1979?
David, you have five minutes. I just wanted to respond.
That's fine. So that's my question. Why did they start to use that terminology? Well, so I had a look, right? And the link I gave you gives the full chapter and verse, but I would say two things. One is that it comes from people who are studying and involved in debates about, one, Afghanistan and the rise of the so-called Afghan rebels, two, the Islamic revolution in Iran, where I currently am. I'm currently in Tehran, so Tehran greets you. And three, the battle against the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And the people who who use these terms are of two categories. First of all, and most prominently and most importantly, in the sense that they theorized them more than others, were Zionists, including the Zionist ideologue, historian, the British historian Bernard Lewis, and also his people who he was a supervisor for or a mentor for, like Martin Kramer, for example, who was in a number of Zionist think tanks in the US. And they started to write about Islamism and Islamists, meaning political Islam in a negative sense. So people so it unites together all the various disparate Muslim political currents. So it puts together the Wahhabis with the Ikhwan, with Shia activism in Iran, and it describes them all as the same thing. It's a racist term for Muslim political activism. And so it comes first of all from the Zionists, but second of all, it comes from people who worked sometimes very closely with Muslim political movements. For example, in Afghanistan, like Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy, the French scholars, and their work using such terminology was, amongst other places, published in a place called Asian Survey. Now, I'd never heard of this when I started doing the research, and of course we discover, with a little bit of digging, this is a CIA front. And so we find, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the CIA and the Zionists, and latterly a British intelligence-linked think tank, the Institute for the Study of Conflict, were the ones which are key to introducing this term into the academic discourse. And now, then the second example I wanted to use, which I'll close with, is the example of Islamic terrorism. Now, the idea that there's a specific form of Islamic terrorism is a new idea. It didn't exist really in the period between 1945 and 1979, partly because we saw in the West the main force behind terrorism as being the Soviet Union. But then after that, after 79, we start to see things differently. If you look at the origins of this, again, are Zionist. The Benjamin Netanyahu's conference, International Terrorism Conference, was an early pioneer of this kind of approach. In 1979, there is a mention in there of Islamic terrorism, but only a very brief mention. In his second conference held in Washington, D.C. in 1984, the conference proceedings published, there was a specific panel on Islamic terrorism. And this is the origins of the idea that Muslims are particularly behind terror, which finds such an audience after 2001, after 9/11. And who chaired the panel? None other than Bernard Lewis and his three co-conspirators, often described in the academic world as the Gang of Four, each one more racist and anti-Muslim than the next. And we have full chapter and verse on that link that I gave you. So the thing I wanted to say, and I could go on to talk much more about contemporary Zionism and Islamophobia, but to conclude, what I wanted to say was that Zionism originates key elements of contemporary Islamophobia. The other thing I should have mentioned, very, very briefly, let me mention, is the conspiracy theory of Eurabia, the idea that the Muslims are outbreeding the non-Muslims in Europe, and that soon the demographic pressure will mean that there are more Muslims in Europe than there are non-Muslims, and this will be a disaster. And that of course, is also a Zionist conspiracy theory created by a woman called Bat Yor, which is her pen name, Giselle Littman, who of course used to be a Mossad agent in Morocco, was involved in a particular Mossad op there to steal Jewish children from Morocco. But let's not go into that anymore. So the Zionists have a specific input into contemporary Islamophobia, which we should be aware of. And I would say, in closing, that at bottom, when you look at every single involvement of Zionist organizations with the questions of Islam, you find, in one way or another, Islamophobia. And I haven't got time to go into to justify that, but I can, if people want to write to me, send them further material on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for discussion. I will just, before we transition into question and answer, I will try to bring together the main theme of the papers and the contribution. Colonialism and its impact on Islamophobia has a very distinct relationship to Muslim societies, because the fact that all colonial powers had a very distinct and specific policy called Muslim policy. The Dutch had it. There was a special department the French had. The British were obviously doing the same thing through Orientalism and the study of Muslims in the subcontinent. So in response to that, the first phase was obviously some of the issues that was talked about by Usman, in which Orientalists not only came to Muslim lands, colonial powers didn't just come to Muslim lands with guns and military, but also with experts and scholars who studied our religion, studied our cultures, documented it, tabulated it, classified it, and through that they started a policy of governance, a very specific one targeting Muslims. So it wasn't just a cultural phenomenon in the case of Muslims. Muslims, as compared to other colonized people, were seen as semi-barbarians. So because we weren't like native tribes or indigenous populations, and we had a civilization, and I think this was touched upon by Kainat's paper, where she spoke about how civilizational rankings were a part of the logic of colonialism, and Muslims played a specific part in Spain. And I was really glad to hear her paper where she highlighted that in Spain, this hierarchy began, and actually it begins from Christianity, because in Spain they passed a law called the Law of Pure Blood, in which the Eucharist logic of purifying your blood by drinking the blood and wine of Christ was projected on all Christians. And those who didn't have pure blood were considered as enemies, and that was then extended into a racial categorization. And the idea of pure blood was then projected onto all non-European peoples. So that was a really interesting contribution, I thought. The second phase of colonialism, in response to this colonialism, there was a number of very threatening publications. So I think Usman must be very familiar with William Hunter's book called The Indian Musalmans, which was a study commissioned by the government of India, in which Muslims in the subcontinent were seen as primary violators of the rebellion, and they were investigated as a security threat, which forms the other very important part of the colonial project, and extends today, as was really which was brought forward by both Muhammad Bashir and also the last speaker, David Miller, where the picture of the Muslim as a terrorist or a security threat to the state is perpetuated now also by Muslim majority states. There's a lot more to talk about, but that's my summary of all the papers. So I open the floor to question and answers, and I'll collect a few, and then maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll have the panelists answer accordingly.
I'm Hajra. I'm also from Pakistan. I want to deconstruct one of your core assumptions, which is about the marginalization of Sufism created the spaces for fanatics, right? And you were particularly talking about our own country, Pakistan. So in the aftermath of the 9/11, you might have seen that there were a lot of debates within the Western world that how the Salafi Islam or Wahhabi Islam is very threatening and it's radicalizing a lot of Muslims. And in response to that, they propped up Sufism or Sufistic version of Islam. And if you go deep into their Western assertion, you will find the reason they liked it is because it separated the politics from the religion. And it deals mostly with the batin and the zahir, right? So, and also Imran Khan established that university. So when you suggest that, don't you think that this is also reiteration of the Western version of the Islam?
Of course. We still have been living in an age of Orientalism. When they talk about Jalaluddin Rumi, how many of you know his original name was Muhammad? 1 or 2, I believe. So I know Narendra Modi, he is the biggest supporter of Sufism. He thinks it's an antidote to fanatics. So I believe that's what I'm saying. That's we have marginalized our spiritual dimension of Sufism, and we have opened it to the Islamophobes who have just taken the advantage of this thing, and they have brought Sufism against traditional values of Islam. So, and I'm looking into this because now they have ripped off again it's a vicious cycle in which first they have disassociated and erasing the spirituality and affinity of Islam from Sufism, and now again they have become the they have become the vocal of and the Sufism, and what they have been doing right now with the Rumi, and in case of that's why but their version of Sufism, if you give me let me show you one slide, I think. Could you please, excuse me, could you put it there, this slide? Not the Western. So, they have been propagating. See, Brad Pitt, he has got tattoo of Rumi. between a wrong, and it's a Coleman box, interpretation and the translation. There exists a field beyond all notion of right and wrong, and see what Rumi has said. Outside unbelief and Islam, there is a desert in the midst of this space. So that's what I am talking about. The ripping of spirituality, and the Sufi spaces are very shrunk in a country like Pakistan. 70% of Pakistan, they are Sunni and they believe in Sufism. But the tiny minority of the fanatics, the groups, they have taken the ground. And ironically, Islamization of Pakistan in the Zia era, they have just shrunk the space for Sufis. So that's what I'm talking about in Pakistan. Imran Khan, I'm a huge admirer of as far as the Sufi stuff is concerned. But it's a huge debate. Imran Khan, what he has been doing, he has been just managing his support base, because he knows that 80% vote comes from Brevi sect, and that's why. So if state instrumentalized religion, again we will end up going nowhere. That's what we have witnessed in Pakistan, in Wahhabism and all.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, before that question, I want to also remind that the colonial project was a reform project, right? So there was this explicit idea of studying Muslims and then reforming their core beliefs in accordance with what was in colonial interests. One of the most key aspects of this was the critique of Wahhabism, which was used by the British as a way of trying to alienate everyday Muslims who were mostly Sufi in orientation. So any Muslim that had a political project that was against the British, they were labeled as Wahhabis. Most of it had nothing to do with their beliefs, or whether they were Ahl Sunnah, or whether they were Shia, or what their exact beliefs was. It was just a tool used by the British to create fear and alienate them from everyday Muslims. That continues today, right? So the governments, for instance, yesterday we had a speech by someone who tried to argue that Islamophobia was the contribution of what are called like mullahs and religious fanatics in Pakistan. So what is actually on the ground and what people believe is very different than the labeling that happens at a very general level. It's a continuation of the colonial project. There's a question behind you then. Can you turn on the mic? Is the mic not working?
I would like to ask Dr. David Miller, is he still with us?
Mr. Miller, are you there? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Doctor, for your explanation about how Zionists try to influence people and spread Islamophobia. But could you please elaborate more about what methods did they use to influence people and spreading Islamophobia? Did they use political, or did they use military, or they use educational sectors? And if there were a real example for that, could you please mention it? Thank you.
So it was done intellectually and culturally. So Bernard Lewis wrote stuff and appeared in places. He was, as I said, he was in the Second International Terrorism Conference in 1984, chairing a panel on Islamic terrorism in the conference organized by Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, those ideas were then taken on through academic journals, through the media, by other ideologues and by those who were close to and were assets of either the ideologues or of the states, meaning especially the state of Israel. So Martin Kramer, for example, had a long time with the Middle East Project in Philadelphia, one of the key Islamophobic think tanks. He then went to a college on occupied territory in Palestine, meaning post-67 occupied territory. So he's been involved in that. He's been involved in a number of other think tanks, both in occupied Palestine and in the US. In terms of the French intellectuals, they of course publish widely in journals and in books, became trusted and well-used experts by the state, by the French state in particular, but also by other NATO powers. So there was a kind of, there emerged an intellectual expert complex of people who were pushing this idea. And it's now, it's infected all of counterterrorism in the UK, the US, other European countries, indeed in some non-Western countries too. And that's the mechanism. So it's an intellectual project, but it's of course backed up by money and indeed by power, meaning of course not just economic power, but also military power in terms of what the US and NATO powers and indeed the State of Israel accomplishes by means of its military forces. So it's an intellectual process predominantly, but it has power backing it up.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Professor Sami?
Thank you. 2 points. First one has to do with Sufism. And because it appears to me that there are 2 trends of Sufism. On one hand, and we see it today, that there is a tacit alliance with some Sufi tariqas with existing power structures who serve colonialist projects, particularly in some of the countries with the legacy of colonialism, Egypt, others. You find these tariqas are pretty much against what would be more an activist Islamic political Islam or what have you, those who have a project towards establishing Islamic states. And you will find consistently the forces that align with Sufism are against them, with a lot of Islamophobic trends. And of course, I mean, people could argue, like Jamil Aydin, that Islamic projects are part of the colonialist legacy, but I disagree with that. So I wanted to reconcile that with the fact that Sufi tariqas or Sufism in the 20th century were anti-colonial forces, because you also see the opposite. So which evidence, or are we talking about 2 different trends within the same legacy? That's one question. The other question has to do with David. I just want to point out to David about one of the other sources of Zionist propaganda, particularly when it came to being part of the Zionist movement, again, propagating Islamophobia, came also because of the first Intifada. We witnessed that firsthand. Not only were there these type of pseudo or so-called intellectuals, the Bernard Lewis students like Martin Kramer and others who came, but also there were operatives. And we saw that with increasing numbers right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They came out of the Mossad. I can mention 2 names, but there are many, many, many others. Some of them pseudo-journalists like Stephen Emerson, but you could also a person by the name of Yigal Carmon. He was a senior advisor to Ariel Sharon. He came and set shop in the United States and start all these organizations that started propagating and peddling all these terms that you called, producing many books. Another guy by the name of Yusuf Budansky, who was the first executive director of an existing institution. They placed it within Congress in the I would say around 87, 88, under the name the Task Force. And because no Democrat was part of it, they renamed it as the Republican Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. This guy, they all came within the first Intifada, 87, 88. They set shop and start talking about Islamic terrorism. Because why? Because the rise of the Islamic movements in Palestine. And now they've already decimated the national movement after the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, and they saw Islam as beginning to take effect not only in Palestine but across the Arab world. So they came with all these names and organizations and the memory and all these. This was creation of these operatives, and I think you need to add that to the body of scholarship as you investigate. He had this Yusuf Budansky guy. guy, he produced so many reports which had the name Congress on it, which was really a fake, because it was only the Republicans party. It wasn't an actual congressional report. It was the Republicans within that. And also you find that he had books, you know, Target the West, Target America, Target, the same book. He would just produce it in different forms, and all what it talks about was obviously Zionist propaganda. So there are a whole legacy that goes with that. And I think we really need to establish serious scholarship to go and trace all these movements, starting from the 70s, but particularly with the, you know, after the 1979 and the Intifada, because you could see there is a real link between the rise of Islamophobia and the Zionist part of this, trying to push it forward. Not to say even about who finances all these. And it's been established that much of the financing of Islamophobia in the United States have been because of the Zionist prominent organizations.
Thank you so much. First, I'll give it to Usman.
The scholarship I have skimmed through in case of subcontinent, I didn't come across, you know, many Sufi orders confronting colonial model. Actually, they, at that time, they had adjusted with the reality and have been the beneficiary of colonialism. And their descendants, what we have been witnessing in Pakistan right now, they are part of the political structure. And I would call them rather passive Sufis, and they have got nothing to do with Sufism. That's why I mentioned in my presentation that actual Sufism is not being practiced in Pakistan. It's very much in the teachings of Sufis. So as far as the political Islam, in case of Pakistan, I believe so, there is not a one voice of Sufis. They're not on one platform, as we can see in case of Jamaat Islami, who propagate, you know, political Islam. So I believe Sufis, they are not much active in politicians. And the Allama Iqbal, that's why he targeted Sufis and Khankas, because he said it's a high time to come up in the, you know, the political stage and contribute your role. But I believe in Pakistan case, Sufis are not, you know, they're part of the problem. Actually, they're not part of the solution. Yeah. So, but the Sufi teachings can. That's what Imran Khan has lately done, and I think Sufism needs to be institutionalized.
Anybody that represents this point of view from the Sufi?
This part is Hazrat Wasif Ali Wasif. I am a huge admirer of. He's a very known, you know, Sufi, and he was he's not like a Sufi who is not, you know, illiterate. He was a very known figure among Pakistan, you know, circles, academic circles, and scholar level. And he has written many books, and he propagated this point of view, which I'm talking about here.
Thank you very much. David Miller has to go, so I'll let him respond very quickly before he jumps off.
Thanks, I have to go. Sorry about that. But yes, you're absolutely right. You know, there's a huge nexus of organizations. You mentioned lots of them there. I mean, we could mention others. I put some more in the chat, but that, you know, that's a small fraction of the Zionist organizations which have proselytized throughout. Now, I didn't know the example you mentioned. Sounds extremely interesting, and I'll certainly follow up on that. Yes, there is a need to do a lot more work in this area. I started off at the beginning in 79, 80, 81, 82, 83 with mentions of the term, but you know, there's much more to do in this. You're absolutely right about that, and I welcome discussions with anyone who is interested in doing more of that. Bye-bye. Thank you.
I want to remind the participants that Sufi tariqas did play a very, very pivotal role in fighting colonialism in many parts of the world. The Sanusiya in Libya, Imam Shamil against Russian colonialism. There was Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. There was also Uthman Dan Fodio in West Africa. There's also in Sudan. Many, and even in I think South Asia, Shah Waliullah in his descendants were Sufis.
But it was reformists.
Yeah, but I mean, they were part of tariqas, and they had spiritual lineages. And everybody in the subcontinent claims lineage from Shah Waliullah. He himself was a philosophical Sufi, in the sense that he wrote many books about Sufism and philosophy, philosophical Sufism. And he was politically active. I mean, he did it right, I think, to I want to say he invited someone from Afghanistan to protect against the Maharathas. I don't remember if that's exactly correct, but he wasn't apolitical. He wasn't an apolitical figure by any means, and his grandchildren weren't either, as far as I remember. The Deoband movement was also the founders of Deoband, although they lean more towards a more scriptural and literalist interpretation of the religion. They were also people of tariqa. They have many books on spirituality in the subcontinent, even though I know there's a high degree of tension between their position and Barelvi position. In any case, I wanted to ask Kainat about, you spoke about solutions. What kind of educational proposals did you have in mind?
Thank you for the question. I was thinking about in European countries, Islam should be taught at educational level in education institutions by Muslims and by Pakistanis. Because if you would allow Europeans to do that, they will do it from their own point of view. And if you allowed us, Muslims or Pakistani, they will, at first students will get first-hand encounter with Muslims and Pakistani, and they will get to know them personally. And at second, they will teach the true Islam and the true culture of Pakistan.
I think that is a very poignant suggestion. The selection of who manages the academic discourse of Islamic studies and Near Eastern studies in North America is quite different from all other fields. So in the United States and many European countries, still the majority amount of instructors, researchers, professors who control the journals, publication series, departments, conferences are mostly European, which, if you think about it statistically, is very strange. So we have, I think, like 1.8 billion Muslims. Even if you take the top 0.01% of academics from the Muslim world, they would overwhelm the amount of positions that are available in the West. And the fact that none of them are considered professional or competitive or competent is not a matter of meritocratic decision. It is, I mean, just Egypt alone could fill all of the positions available in America. The fact that, you know, there's still people who are underqualified who have control over the academic discourse is a site of perpetual misconceptions in the Muslim world. I wanted to also bring in as a last comment, if there's no other comments or questions from the, I wanted Muhammad Mubashir Saleem to tell us a little bit about what he thinks would be a way of countering the kind of Islamophobia that has been inherited from colonialism.
Thank you, sir. There is a great work which is required to do to counter Islamophobia in contemporary world. On many aspects, we will have to do a lot of work extensively. For example, to counter the narrative of Islamophobia, we should train our intellectuals, our students And for that matter, I think the true teachings of Islam, Quran, and other disciplines should be brought to the students. For therefore, Islamization of knowledge is very important, which is put forward by Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, that Islamization of knowledge, which is relevant to our contemporary world, is so much significant for all the universities, for all the scholars who are doing their work to counter Islamophobia. And therefore, there are some platforms for managing these intellectuals, and should be there in East and in the West, that those scholars are linked to each other, and they should raise their voice collectively. It is not a matter of politics. It is not a matter of other things. Basically, intellectuals would train our politicians, our administrators, to how to counter this whole phenomena of Islamophobia.
Thank you very much. I will give everybody a minute to give their final remark if there is anything they would like to say. But before I leave, I would like to say that your suggestion of a Muslim academic network is very important. And a subtle, I think, note that I read recently about the talks that happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was hosted by China was that in the talks, they refused to use English as a language, a diplomatic language of communication. And I found that to be very promising. And unfortunately, still as Muslim academics, we rely on English to communicate with each other. But I think it is a matter of priority that we also have the ability to discuss our problems and concerns in our own languages. That would require us to have a lot more integration. So, learning Turkish, learning Farsi, learning Arabic, learning Urdu, learning Swahili, learning other, Muslim languages, Malaya, Indonesian. This is the way that we can have a more intra-Muslim conversation, something that I think is still a colonial legacy. Anyways, if you have any last comment, you have a minute to give a final thought. Usman? Muhammad Mubashir, do you have anything you would like to say before we conclude?
I would like to thank all the intellectuals. It was very thought-provoking for ourselves, and we should find ways to counter Islamophobia in more intellectual and digitalized manner, because it is not to write articles, it is not to write books on Islamophobia. Basically, Islamophobia is shown by West on digital level. Images, pictures, movies, they are used to spread Islamophobia. So I think we should work on more broader level to counter this phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Kainat?
As a sociologist, I would like to say that before going into the depth or before raising any voice against anything, one should go into the social and cultural basis of that thing into history, such as Islamophobia, because before knowing anything in depth, we can't see, we can't just make our own perceptions about it. We can't just make any think without forgetting our biases. So even if I am a Muslim, I'm a Pakistani, if I wrote a paper, I try to write it from a very unbiased point of view, because there are some other peoples out there who are not Muslims but who support the idea of combating Islamophobia. So this platform is indeed a very great platform to gather people from around the world to talk in this serious issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before we leave, oh, yeah, go ahead.
I really like to urge you people to just understand the patterns of Orientalism. I didn't mention earlier, we need to learn why Ibn Sina is called Averroes today. Avicenna, sorry, and Ibn Rushd is called Averroes, and Al-Khwarizmi is called Algorithmi. They have stolen our, intellectual legacy, and now what I was talking about our spiritual legacy. So we need to understand, because I heard someone was talking about Averroes. I was having a word with. So we need to understand they were our own peoples, and we need to read about our golden age of Islam while just staying in the phantoms of golden age. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We sign off. I want to thank Yunus Akhtani's and the technical team and all the people in the background who are working. This is not easy to do. I mean, to make it seem like it's flawless, all this, the mics and the videos from abroad, and then people in the hall, all of this it seems flawless, but it's extremely hard to put together. And I really thank Yunus, Jamila, and the brother here. Thank you so much for all of your hard work.